I hesitate to introduce my voice after an hour of what one might call poetry, but nonetheless I have to. So I see that people have, good, those who do need to leave have done, but we do have a period, probably of half an hour or so, for questions for Professor Brown.
Any of you remember the name of the Anglican priest who wrote Rabbi Jesus? None of you have read the book or know the name of the author. He suggests that Jesus' repeated Eucharistic feasting caused his family real hardship, especially the women who had to do the work. Just wanted to offer that observation, and I wonder if you could gloss, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the earth," as opposed to the rich in spirit, or would that be the poor, in spirit?
Well, Christians for the next 1,000 years spent their time glossing it. So it's not really for me to do any further glossing. I think it's very important to remember, though, that at this time, you're looking at a very stratified society where actually both people really are poor, dirt poor, and other people voluntarily, and I think this is important, voluntarily, opt for the helplessness of the poor. The helplessness of the poor. That is, we now, I think, tend to say in spirit means merely in spirit. This, I think, is much more like the Syriac makika, which means squashed. The squashed. And I think there was always room in this very harsh society for heroic people who really did opt to be squashed, when they didn't have to be squashed. So I think we should really avoid the modern reading of that phrase in terms of a distinction between spirit alone and mere economic. So you're not just enjoying being wealthy, but of course you're poor in spirit. You opt to be poor, to be makika. There's a very good translation, a German translation of the works of a major renouncer who was a very rich man indeed, Paulinus of Nola. And Paulinus uses the word humilis. And, Paulinus remained, in Marilyn Monroe's words, a rich millionaire. But he did opt out of his senatorial status. And when he wrote humilis, he meant it. And the German translator, seeing this, translated it very well as bedeutungslos, unimportant. So I think we should always remember that we're dealing with a society where economic categories, which seem so absolute to us, were only one of many ways of cutting up the joint. And certainly voluntary poverty. I think if you were a late Roman person, you would interpret this as voluntary poverty. Those who have undertaken poverty to join the squashable class. And you notice not every monk had an easy time. We hear of the ones who are successful. I think there were a lot of heroic monks who got well and truly beaten up for wandering round.
Is it not also the extension of that beyond just the monastic life, but to any believer who recognizes their poverty before God spiritually, or in every way, and the fact...
I can't hear very well.
Okay. I see that as extending beyond the monastic life as to every believer who recognizes their poverty before God, so that in their weakness, the strength and power of God might be perfected. Would you comment on that?
I think Augustine would have agreed entirely with you. I think there are a lot of people who would have thought that was an insufficient rendering. I think that one has to actually reckon for the real challenge of voluntary unimportance and not simply humility in the face of God. I think obviously humility in the face of God in both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity of a transcendent, overpowering deity is a primary virtue, but it's often treated as the basic template from which other forms of voluntary self-abasement in society happened. Yes? Yeah, please. And then.
Sorry. Just a quick question here. In the beginning, you mentioned that there was this reference about Christian etiquette and how they should enter a village. And that reminded me of an essay that you had, or an introduction to Metcalfe's work on virtue ethics in Edom. And so the question is, can you comment on virtue ethics or etiquette or practical ethics within the Manichaean tradition? And how much is extant from that?
Well, it's part of the general late antique view that you have to look what you are. I mean, we are an extraordinarily undemonstrative society compared with late antiquity. If you're a philosopher, you've got to wear a beard. If you're a senator, you've got to wear a toga. Clear what you are inside has to be shown outside. You can't just sort of pretend. So in that sense, the Manichaean elect were always known to look pale. They were constantly being accused by their enemies of using makeup. That gives you some idea. Their hands would have to be soft. They would have to look pale. Monks also had to look pale. And what's very interesting is how quickly a sort of style of agreed monastic dress, a sort of duffel coat, a sort of djellaba, it was socially marked as just a simple man's clothes, but it did become standard extremely quickly. So you are dealing with a very expressive world. On the other hand, there's the other dimension, which is, of course, in both Manichaeism and Syriac Christianity, the enormous emphasis on the hidden divinity in Christ. That is, Christ is like Odysseus returning to Ithaca as a pauper. It's a king disguised. It's a veiling of the divinity in humanity. So there is also a very profound veiling of the real, power of the real power center of the divinity, but in a world where by and large an ascetic must look like an ascetic. And it's very interesting when by the time you reach the 6th century, if a bleeding monk wants to escape Constantinople, say, for getting on the wrong side of the authorities, he dresses like a beggar. He had obviously been dressing in a poor way, but in a recognizable way. So he opted for, in that case, just a disguise.
I was wondering, by the way,
excuse me.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I was wondering, given the way you described the attitude toward labor in the Eastern Church, what the attitude toward the Sabbath was among ordinary people.
Oh, Christians were great Sabbatarians whenever they had a chance to be. I think once again the temptation, well, I mean, as in Ethiopic Christianity nowadays, Christianity is superior because it is 2 Sabbaths. I think that notion of, I mean, I think more seriously, that notion that there must be one day of the week where one is totally free to worship God, linked to notions of creation, linked to notions of the first moment of creation, which lie behind both the Jewish Sabbath and the Christian day of resurrection, but very soon becomes day of the restoration of creation as it should be. So, and of course, obviously, the monks always think of themselves, always say, we are celebrating the perpetual Sabbath. And that certainly in the Syriac, Aramaic world has deep Jewish roots and is part, I think, of the general religious common sense shared by Jews and Christians. I mean, ancient people, they love knocking off work. One must remember Rome. I mean, how do you show you're a real conquering city, that you really are top dog? I know how you show it. You have 157 public holidays in the year. That's the way to do it. And of course, in a world of seasonal labor, we always talk about work as if you're constantly doing it, and I think peasant work remains very demanding. But if you look at the work rhythms of great Egyptian monasteries, you actually find that these people, although they are committed to work, they knock off for about 3 months every year.
Let's have one more question. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, with the time you were talking about and the areas you're talking about what percentage were people Manichaeans? And then the second with that would be, what was their relationship with the government or the political leaders? Was there any relationship? Was it positive, negative, or they just ignored it, or what?
The Manichaeans were always a very small minority, but in this sort of society, you shouldn't underestimate the power of minorities. Monks themselves were a small minority, but anybody doing something radically different from what everyone else did stirred people up. With the Manichaeans, it's a bit like communism in the McCarthy epoch. You better not be one. You better not even be connected with one. Bishops spend a lot of time accusing each other of being Manichaeans. It's the best slur possible. Augustine spent his old age defending himself against the charge of being a Manichaean. So, and there on governmental circles, probably I think it is because it is of Persian origin. Mani was not a Roman subject. The government came down heavy. The Emperor Diocletian persecuted Manichaeans as non-Roman, as anti-Roman, as Persian, 6 years before the Great Persecution. So the Manichaeans were the real whipping boy of the Christian and Roman pagan world. The monks of Syria, no way. You love to have your friendly neighborhood angel. So I agree that monks in Egypt always tend to grossly exaggerate the numbers in their monasteries. I don't think the Syrians really worried very much. You just needed one human wake-up call in the right place. Simeon Stylites is very important. People like Simeon Stylites are only 10 miles off the main Roman road from Antioch to the Persian frontier. These are not people hidden away.
I think perhaps we should draw this period of open questions to a close, but you're all, of course, invited to continue the conversation at the reception. Also, please don't forget, if you need the parking permits, I have them. Come and talk to me. But before we depart, please, let's thank Professor Brown for another extraordinary lecture.